Hello, Peter for Zero Cyrus here, and I'm going to be reviewing the infamous title, Final Fantasy 13. Now, you're probably wondering why I'm doing a review for this game when it got released 2 years ago in 2010. The answer is pretty simple, I just beat the game. If you saw my backlog video back in 2011, then you will saw that Final Fantasy 13 was one of the games in my backlog. I got this game in 2010, but then several games came out that kind of pushed this into a backlog. But after playing Final Fantasy 13 a bit at a time throughout the 2 years, I finally beat the game. I would now want to share my overall opinion on the game. Final Fantasy 13 is an RPG that was both developed and published by Square Enix.
Close call. And the hero saves the day!
Graphically, the game looks amazing. Final Fantasy 13 is probably one of the best looking RPGs out in the market, even at this time, which is pretty impressive in my honest opinion. Both the in-game cut graphics and the CGI cutscenes are phenomenal, and the animations are fantastic as well. It's no stretch on the imagination to say that Final Fantasy 13 is one of the best looking RPGs that the PS3 got to offer. Environments also look great, ranging from the metropolis of Cocoon to the wilderness of Grand Pulse. Dungeon designs is well, I see no point in hiding the fact dungeon design in Final Fantasy 13 is non-existent. I say this because it's basically a linear corridor for all of the dungeons that you traverse to, well, most of them. So there's not really much to explore in the dungeons. Story is also a mixed bag. The plot of the game gets you to follow a group of individuals who, due to circumstances, being purged from Cocoon to Grand Pulse. After certain events, these individuals are given a focus from a post Fal'Cie, which now makes them Fal'Cie, who are individuals who have magical abilities, which is also a curse since if they don't find out what their focus is and fulfill it in time, they will turn to monsters, but if they do fulfill it, they turn to living crystals. Yeah, you're probably confused by the intro synopsis on the game that I made, but truth be told, at the start of the game, it doesn't really do a better job than me explaining it. The game's storytelling is really confusing with how they throw you all these different terms at the start of the game and they don't really explain it, such as Fal'Cie, Fal'Cie, Grand Pulse, Cocoon, etc. But why the intro is a tad confusing, they do explain what each of these terms means later on in the story, and they do give certain backstory to the main characters explaining how they were in the purge in the first place. But overall, the story is very convoluted. It's kind of confusing throughout the game to the point that you have to sometimes refer to the data log, which is the encyclopedia of the game. And at the ending, it's even more convoluted. And that's sort of a bad thing where you need to refer to the game encyclopedia in order to figure out what's happening to the plot. But there is one thing that I like about the story. And even though the plot is very convoluted, the one thing I really like about it is the dynamic between certain characters from chapter 2 to 11. The characters themselves aren't special in any means, but seeing how they cope with the fact that they're cursed with being a Fal'Cie, and seeing how the relationship of these people develop and change from the start of chapter 2 to chapter 11 was pretty interesting to me. But then again, it's pretty much at chapter 11 where the story in Final Fantasy 13 kicks the convoluted factor into overdrive. So overall, why I didn't really care for the overall plot in Final Fantasy 13, I did like the dynamic between the main characters in the game. Character wise, like I said previously, I like the main cast of characters. Just the antagonists that don't really get fleshed out. But overall, since the game focuses mostly on the main characters, I have to say I like the characters in the game. Voice acting is great, though there are some very awkward dialogue issues throughout the game. The soundtrack is great, if a tad different from other Final Fantasies. Overall, Final Fantasy 13 got good presentation, the graphics, soundtrack, environments, and character dynamics. With its convoluted story and dialogue issues dragging it down a lot, what could have been a great presentation to simply good presentation. The first thing I go into is the combat system that Final Fantasy 13 employs. The game uses an active time turn-based combat system, which is a mixture of turn-based combat and real-time combat. We have to wait for the ATB gauge to fill up before attacking, but battles do not stop when you're selecting a command. The active time turn-based combat system is a staple of the Final Fantasy series, and it changes for each game that it appears in. For Final Fantasy 13 variation, the ATB system, the first and foremost thing you'll probably notice is the disappearance of MP. Now, spells or special abilities are determined by how many ATB gauge you have at your disposal. You will have 2 at the start of the game, but then you get a total of 5 when you're at the end of the game, which will allow you to combine more attacks together. You also notice there's an ability option and an auto battle option in the menu screen when you're in battle. Selecting from the ability option will let you manually choose which attack you want to use, while auto battle will select the attacks for you. Though, there's one big problem with auto battle at the start of the game. It's that the AI in this game are pretty smart, to the point where you don't really have to do anything than select auto battle for the early parts of the game, which it really makes the game boring at that part, gameplay wise. But the battle gets more fun as you need to use the paradigm shift in order to move on in the battle. The paradigm shift is basically a system which allows your character to be in one specific role to another, such as paradigm shifting Fang Sentinel role to a Saboteur role, which will allow her to put various status effects on her enemies now as compared to her Sentinel role where she was a tank. Each role is pretty unique from each other, and knowing which role will suit each character best would be instrumental in continuing the game. Well, into chapter 11, but I get to what I mean later on when I talk about the leveling system of the game. There's also the stagger bar you see at the top of the screen. Each time you use an attack, the stagger gauge will increase, and when it reaches to 100%, the enemy will be in stagger mode, which means they will receive more damage than usual. Overall, the combat system can be fun at times after the initial hours of the game when paradigm shift is both introduced and becomes significant. Since the paradigm shift requires the players to decide which role will suit each individual character the best before battle in preparation, but it also requires players to decide which paradigm shift would be ideal for certain parts of a battle. The ranking system also prompts you to be efficient in the game, which also adds to the fun of the combat system. But there's one big flaw to Final Fantasy 13 combat system, even though I found the core gameplay to be fun. Is that there's no tension in the battle. I don't mean there isn't any difficulty in the battle, since the enemy does have some difficulty in them, which will require you to use the paradigm shift mechanic to its fullest. It's the fact that each of your battle doesn't really have any consequence to it. Even if you lose a battle, you'll have the option to retry. I can get this option in boss battles, since sometimes you need to reconfigure your strategy in order to proceed, but when the retry option is available to each encounter, it doesn't really engage the players, since there's no consequence when they lose. I like the fact that you get a game over when the character you control dies, makes the combat system in Final Fantasy 13 very flawed. Next is the leveling system, which is the Crystallarium system. It's odd in my honest opinion, because it doesn't really know what it wants to do. At the start of the Crystallarium, it looks like the sphere grid in Final Fantasy X, where you have to earn points in battle, then use those said points to unlock a grid. But it's very linear at first, so I didn't really saw the point of the Crystallarium system when a linear leveling system and a separate menu screen for learning skills could have done the job. Also add the fact that each character were pretty unique to each other in terms of stats and certain abilities, and I thought the game was trying to aim for a progression system that tries to differentiate characters, but then the system does a 180 at chapter 11, where it gives you so much customization that each character can learn every role and ability available. That kinda makes the character a bit samey. So overall, I didn't really care for the system, since at first the Crystallarium system was so linear that I thought a linear progressive system and a skill menu would have worked out. And it opens up at the end of near the end of the game, where all the customization option is kinda useless, as you're nearing the end of the game and focusing on any other role would be a waste of time at that point. Next is the weapon upgrading system. In order to upgrade your weapon, you receive items that you can put into your weapon itself, which will give you experience points, and when the weapon get enough experience points, it will level up, which it will give better stats. But I have one problem with it, is that with the weapon themselves. The base stats of each weapon are so very similar to each other that you won't know which weapon would be best to upgrade outside of looking at a guide. Exploration wise, Final Fantasy 13 is extremely linear. I don't mean that by dungeon design alone. When you go through the game, you can't go back to any of the previous areas, and the actual fact there's really no town to explore, and the only direction you can go is forward. Final Fantasy 13 is an extremely linear RPG, where it only really opens up at chapter 11. Lengthwise, it took me about 45 hours to beat the game, and there is a few side missions you can do at chapter 11 and at the end of the game. Overall, Final Fantasy 13 gameplay is extremely flawed. With its odd crystallium system, the combat system, while I found at times, lacks tension, and the upgrading system is pretty flawed in that you can't really know which weapon is best to upgrade, since their stats are so identical to the first weapon you get. Overall, Final Fantasy 13 is a very flawed game. The game has fantastic visuals, great soundtrack, good character dynamics, and a somewhat fun combat system, but there are a good amount of flaws that really pose it down, such as the combat lacking any sort of tension, because of the retry option being available in every encounter, the combat system being a bit boring at the start of the game, the upgrade system being flawed due to all the weapons you collect having nearly the same stats, so you won't really have any idea which weapon to upgrade, convoluted story, and there is a few small issues that makes it a bit annoying as well, such as the main character that you control dies, you get game over. But even with the issues, I still somewhat enjoy my time playing through the game. And it's not the worst RPG I've played this gen, but it is probably the worst Final Fantasy title that I've played. But then again, that might not count for much since I've only played and beat a few Final Fantasies. I personally give this game a 5.5 out of 10. A game that has good presentation, but the gameplay issues really drag it down.